Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast. Episode 108, The Seleucid Empire, the Maccabean Revolt. In 168, the army of Antiochus IV was at the gates of Jerusalem. Fresh from his war in Egypt, the king was filled with rage as he learned of the conflict brewing inside of the city, and would hand out a terrible punishment, violating its famed temple and unleashing a wave of persecution that would be immortalized by Jewish writers as the actions of a monster and a madman. Why did this come to pass? Prior to 168, relations between the Seleucid crown and the Jews were largely amicable. Following his victory at the Battle of Panium in 200, Antiochus III was granted mastery over Coeli Syria, in part thanks to the high priest Simon II, who helped organize a change of allegiance towards the Seleucid cause. For their trouble, Jerusalem and its countryside suffered widespread damage thanks to Ptolemaic counterattack, so the end of the war in 195 allowed for a moment's respite for those caught in the crossfire. As a reward for their loyalty in the conflict, Josephus reports that Antiochus ordered a royal decree on behalf of Jerusalem, which contained the following clauses. The collateral damage inflicted upon the city and its temple will be restored with the assistance of the crown in the form of cash payments, supplies, and tax exemptions on construction materials to ensure that the daily sacrifices would continue. Next, he announced that the Jews would be allowed to live under their traditional laws, while the Gerousia, the priests, and other temple officials would be exempt from the poll tax. Then, to restore the city's population, many of whom were scattered or exiled, he granted the rest of the Jerusalemites 3 years free taxation, permanently reduced their annual tribute by 1/3, and lastly declared the freedom of the Jews who were enslaved during the fighting. He then later followed up with an additional proclamation to step in and protect the religious customs, prohibiting foreigners from entering the temple or bringing unclean animals into the city. Outside of Josephus' accounts, an inscription from the settlement of Scythopolis, modern Beth Zur, dating to March of 195, also shows that Antiochus attempted to curb the bad behavior of troops passing through Judean villages. Antiochus' actions certainly appear to be quite generous to his newly won Jewish subjects, but the king would have had a vested interest in doing so. Coeli Syria was the prize that the Seleucid dynasty had long sought, and it was a lucrative region, economically speaking. The years of fighting caused widespread devastation. It would be an unwise move for the king to try and squeeze the beleaguered Judeans for cash when they were just beginning to recover. The model of the decree is true to form with the typical practices of Hellenistic benefactions, and its primary target was the elite of Jerusalem, namely the city council and the priests, and the temple, the driving actor of the local economy. It was no doubt a product of some negotiation between the king and those members, and we have little information as to how the lower classes were impacted, as neither they nor the rest of Judea outside of the city are mentioned beyond the general notion of protecting their right to their ancestral laws. Nevertheless, the initiatives put into place by Antiochus allowed the region to stabilize for the rest of his reign, and we have no reported incidents between them and the new government. The first real sign of trouble came under the rule of Seleucus IV, who took over in 187 after his father's death in Elam. Seleucus continued to hold fast to the terms arranged by Antiochus, extracting about 300 talents of silver as Judea's annual tribute, but is also said to have provided the temple some sort of financial relief. However, according to the author of 2nd Maccabees, an incident involving the Seleucid minister Heliodorus took place involving the sanctity of the temple in 178. As the story goes, a temple official in charge of the finances named Simon had quarreled with the standing high priest Onias III regarding the regulation of the marketplace. Simon took matters up the chain of command by claiming that funds were secretly being allocated to the temple treasury. Heliodorus was commanded by the king to retrieve this money while making his tour of the satrapy, and so he confronted Onias about the unaccounted-for silver upon reaching Jerusalem. The high priest claimed that the so-called treasure was largely a public fund for widows and orphans, but this did little to stave off the minister. He then barged into the temple, intent on retrieving the valuables inside, but found himself struck with terror, for the prayers of the citizens and priests to prevent their sacred space from being violated led to an apparition of a golden armored mounted warrior who swept from the heavens to knock Heliodorus off his feet, and the dazed official was further beaten by two angelic youths. Unconscious, he was carried away on a stretcher, but rather than punish him further, Onias generously protected him from additional harm, lest Seleucus think that the Jews had conspired against the crown. Once back in the court of Antioch, Heliodorus would sing the praises of the Jewish god, warning the king against taking further action against a being so mighty and powerful as he. On the surface, the story of Heliodorus' attempted plundering of the temple appears to have very little in the way of historical truth, given the supernatural elements associated with it. Looking past that, we may find details that reveal more than what meets the eye. As per his role of prostates of the temple, Simon was in part responsible for gathering taxes for the crown, and his attempted takeover of the marketplace, which would mean directly interfering with the region's largest economic driver, the temple itself. We also get hints of a dispute involving other political actors. In his explanation to Heliodorus, Onias claimed that part of the funds stored in the temple actually belonged to Hyrcanus, the same man who built the palace at Iraq al-Amir. If we can recall, Hyrcanus was part of the Tobiad family that had managed to rise to power under Ptolemaic rule. But while the Tobiads largely switched allegiances to the Seleucids, Hyrcanus had fled to his estate in the Transjordan and remained loyal to the Ptolemies. Safeguarding the money of a Ptolemaic agent would have been incredibly inflammatory, so this naturally would have encouraged Heliodorus to investigate further. Divine intervention aside, some have viewed the story as a symbolic resistance to the growing desire against increased Seleucid control and regulation of the economic activities of Judea, equating attempted tax reforms with that of an attempted plundering of the temple. Epigraphic evidence has been discovered which does add some detail to the story of 2nd Maccabees. A limestone stele, discovered at the site of Maresha in ancient Idumea, preserves the correspondence between King Seleucus and Heliodorus. Here the king ordered the appointment of a Phaloi named Olympiodorus as the high priest overseeing the temples of Coeli Syria and Phoenicia, so that they may continue to receive the, quote, traditional honors with the care befitting them, as they previously had no one in the role. The language is couched in the moral imperative of a ruler for the good of his subjects, but there is a clear indication that some degree of administrative reform is going on in the region, though whether it was related to increased taxation is not entirely certain. In the end, Heliodorus failed in his mission, and the status quo was returned, though it would remain undisturbed for long, since in 175, the minister is said to have orchestrated the murder of Seleucus, then placing the child king Antiochus on the throne of Syria as his puppet. This arrangement was quickly broken up by the arrival of Seleucus' brother Mithridates, who executed Heliodorus and took the crown for himself, rechristened as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Parallel to his rise to power in Syria, a schism of sorts was taking place in Jerusalem at the same time. According to the books of Maccabees, a group of so-called Hellenizers, led by one Jason, brother of Onias, had approached the newly enthroned Antiochus with a proposition. Onias was to be removed from power, and Jason was to be installed as high priest of the city, and in return they promised 360 talents of silver as new tribute, along with another 80 talents up front as a bribe. More importantly, Jason was willing to offer another bonus of 150 talents if he was granted the right to enroll the Jerusalemites as citizens of Antioch, setting up a gymnasium and the body of youths known as the Ephebes, in effect creating a new polis. Eager to get his hands on any source of income and potentially better integrate a large city in Coeli Syria, Antiochus was delighted at the proposal, agreeing and appointing Jason as the new high priest, while Onias fled from Jerusalem towards Antioch. And so the gymnasium was built near the temple, with many like-minded Jews flocking to take part in the new institution. Young Jewish noblemen were enrolled into the Ephebes, adopted the latest in Greek fashions, and indulged in activities like discus and wrestling. Some went so far as to voluntarily undergo epispasm, a cosmetic procedure that reversed the practice of male circumcision. This allowed them to participate in the traditionally nude exercises of the gymnasium without fear of mockery, since the Greek perception of the ideal human body had little tolerance for what they saw as an aberrant custom. But this was also a break in the covenant established between God and the founder Abraham, and what some saw as an outright rejection of their Jewish identity. This situation transpired over a period of about 3 years, but in 170, another major shakeup occurred. Menelaus, brother of the disgruntled temple worker Simon, was tasked by Jason to deliver the collected tribute to King Antiochus, but after arriving in Antioch, he flipped on his superior, purchasing the position of high priest after promising to nearly double the annual tribute. If our sources disapproved of Jason, who was forced out of Jerusalem into the Tobiad estates near Iraq al-Amir, Menelaus was considered even worse. A tyrant in all but name, he routinely neglected his duties and skimmed money from the temple funds, and was much more enthusiastic about bending towards a policy of Hellenization than Jason ever was. The position of high priest was a hereditary one, consistently passed down from father to son through the Zadokite line, and held predominantly by the Oneid family ever since before the Macedonian conquest. With Antiochus' appointment of Jason and the removal of Ananias III, this marked the first time that the succession was broken by outside intervention, but at least he was a member of the Zadokite family, whereas Menelaus lacked any relation to the Zadokites whatsoever. The mere fact that 3 high priests were coexisting at the same time clearly demonstrated the rapidly declining authority of that office, a key message that 2nd Maccabees seems to argue. Living in exile near Antioch in the neighborhood of Daphne, the sheltered Onias was made privy to an incident when Menelaus stole treasures from the temple and resold them at a profit. When he tried to rally his fellow Jews to speak out against this outrage, Menelaus convinced the Seleucid agent Andronicus to murder Onias, who was treacherously killed even as he sought sanctuary in the grove of Apollo. This blatant violation of its sanctity outraged Jews and Gentiles alike, including the king, who, acting as an instrument of God's wrath, humiliated and executed Andronicus for his transgressions. Tensions rose in Jerusalem over this and the further abuses from Menelaus' cronies, leading to a riot that saw bloodshed on both sides. Members of the Gerousia were sent to Antiochus' court in Tyre to convince him to prosecute the corrupt high priest, but to no avail, as Menelaus already bribed local officials and ensured his acquittal from the king. These delegates were then executed on the high priest's request, but the local Tyrians intervened and paid for their funerals lest their bodies be desecrated. Such was the state of affairs in Judea leading up to the end of 170. Tensions were escalating as Menelaus continued to run roughshod with his abuses of power, but the king was occupied with much more pressing concerns. In November of that year, the government of Ptolemy Philometor launched an invasion into Seleucid territory in an effort to reclaim their lost satrapy, beginning the 6th Syrian War. Antiochus was already well prepared for this day, and managed to win a stunning victory near Mount Casion that allowed his army to march as far as the Nile Delta. After attempting to manipulate the dynastic squabbles of Ptolemy VI and VIII to little success, Antiochus returned to Coile, Syria in the late summer of 169, where he remained for the next several months in winter quarters. He renewed his attack in the spring of 168, which saw massive gains as he conquered as far as Upper Egypt and left the Ptolemies trapped in Alexandria under siege. Despite seemingly on the verge of total victory, the Roman ambassador Gaius Popilius Laenas arrived in the king's camp in July, ordering that the king keep his hands off of Egypt and to return home. To this, Antiochus acquiesced, and so the war was brought to an end. During the 6th Syrian War, the chaos that was brewing in Jerusalem spilled over, which would lead to severe repercussions. Unfortunately, the chronology of the crisis in Judea is deeply confused by our sources, who report different dates, incidents, and the structure of how it played out. Therefore, I am going to follow the narrative that best makes sense to me, but understand that it is highly debated in the scholarship. In 168, a false rumor reached Jerusalem suggesting that Antiochus was killed in action, which inspired the then deposed high priest Jason to try and seize his former position from Menelaus. he led a force of 1,000 men to try and retake the city, forcing Menelaus to seek refuge in the citadel. It is not clear whether this was exclusively an opportunistic move led by Jason's part, or if he was heading a larger rebellion of the populace against Menelaus's abuses. The end result was the same, as Antiochus caught wind of the violence happening in Judea. The king was already inwardly seething at the embarrassment suffered at the hands of the Romans, but news of his representative, and by extension his authority as king, being threatened was beyond the pale. Jason abandoned his mission and fled to the Nabateans in the south to avoid the wrath of the incoming king, but little it did for the Jerusalemites, who watched in horror as the Seleucid army marched upon their city. The punishment was swift and terrible. Antiochus attacked Jerusalem, slaughtering and enslaving many of its inhabitants who came across his path over a period of 3 days. Menelaus had been restored to his position, but was ordered by the king to lead him into the temple. Epiphanes and his troops entered the Holy of Holies without concern for its sanctity, plundered much of the treasures inside, including many of the relics, and made off with about 1,800 talents worth of silver. This was but the first stage of terror inflicted upon the Judeans. Menelaus was to remain as high priest, but Antiochus left behind 2 commanders in Jerusalem and Mount Gerizim, along with an occupying force to watch over them. Within the same year, or perhaps in 167, the king sent his official Apollonius to enact a series of sweeping changes. Using the cover of the Sabbath as part of his deception, Apollonius launched another attack against the citizens of Jerusalem, killing and enslaving many more. With a good number of the population scattered and much of the city destroyed, the Seleucid official was ordered to pull down the walls of the city and establish a new fortification upon the former citadel, called the Acra. A garrison was to be installed in the Acra, along with foreign settlers to repopulate the city, but it is also clear that Jews took residence here as well, most likely members of Menelaus's contingent, as the author of 1st Maccabees calls them sinful or renegades. As the final cherry on top, the author of 1st Maccabees states that, quote, "Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs." End quote. This was followed up by groups of messengers to be dispersed to Jerusalem and Judea at large, announcing that the Jews were to cease their traditional ways of life, or face the penalty of death. The tamid, the daily offering, by the high priest on the behalf of the Jewish nation was banned. The Second Temple was turned into a new place of worship for pagan cults, particularly that of Antiochus's patron deity, Zeus Olympios. This culminated on December the 7th of 167, the 25th of Kislev in the Hebrew calendar, with the establishment of what Daniel dramatically calls the abomination of desolation, placed atop the former altar of burnt offerings. This persecution of Jewish customs also was extended to outside the temple. Circumcision was banned outright, and copies of the Torah were to be destroyed on sight. 2nd Maccabees is replete with stories of martyrdoms that took place during these persecutions. The most famous is of a mother and her 7 sons, who were arrested after refusing to consume pork and were brought forth before Antiochus. One by one, each of the sons was tortured to death, but they and their mother remained steadfast throughout the process, until all were killed by the irate king, who failed to get them to break their covenant. The extent to which these atrocities were committed on the orders of the Seleucid government seems rather exaggerated. However, it doesn't appear to be limited to just Jewish sources. Heliodorus claims that Antiochus attempted to root out the practice of Jewish laws by sacrificing a pig in front of an image of Moses, sprinkled the swine's blood on the temple altar and the books of the Hebrew Bible, then forced others to consume its flesh. The position of the Jewish authors are clear. Antiochus was evil incarnate, the worst excesses of a Gentile despot. The so-called Antiochene crisis is one of the most complex subjects to discuss when talking about Greco-Judean relations during the Hellenistic period, for the extent of its violence is surprising even in the context of the ancient world, and many have tried to determine its causes. There are a few questions to ask. Firstly, was Antiochus a passionate supporter of Hellenization, though? First Maccabees passage about the king ordering that all subject peoples be unified under a monolithic culture, that of the Greeks, would certainly like to have us believe it so. Epiphanes is almost universally characterized as a generous benefactor, primarily to Greek sanctuaries and temples, and one of the most unique aspects of his reign was his passionate devotion to Zeus Olympius as a patron deity, a god that was strictly Greek in form. Philhellenic Euergetism and the worship of Zeus is hardly unique among Hellenistic monarchies, but his persecution of Jewish practices dramatically differed from the policies employed by virtually every preceding Seleucid king. Historically, the dynasty was quite willing to work with the traditional religious institutions of their subject peoples, so long as they didn't threaten the authority of the crown. The extent to which the Jewish sources play up the atrocities may be for dramatic purposes, but even some Greco-Roman authors seem to realize that the response was rather severe and purpose-driven. Writing centuries later, the Roman historian Tacitus, normally quite critical of the Jews, claims that Antiochus's policies were intended to Hellenize them and to end their superstitious ways. However, one important area to consider is the financial aspects of the crisis. Throughout the story, we find that the sources frequently mention money, be it in the form of tribute or plunder, as a source of conflict. When looking at the financial system of the Seleucid Empire during this period and how it relates to the escalation, scholars are ultimately divided into two camps. Antiochus' behavior was part of a larger pattern of financial insolvency that was hounding the Seleucid treasury since the Treaty of Apamea in 189, compelling the king to increasingly manipulate the finances of Judea and leading to the plunder of the temple. Others think that the theory of insolvency may be overdrawn, and that Antiochus' attack on Jerusalem was a sharp departure from the relationship established between the crown and Jerusalem. Others think that the theory of insolvency may be overdrawn, that Antiochus' attack on Jerusalem was a sharp departure from the relationship established between the crown and the Jews, and was due to some other extenuating circumstance. Looking at the first option, the indemnity placed upon the Seleucid realm in 189 by the Roman Republic was certainly hefty. 12,000 talents to be paid out in equal increments over 12 years, plus an additional 3,000 immediately up front, was going to be troublesome for even a state as large as the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus IV may be remembered as a weak ruler, precisely because the cost of maintaining the army on campaign would have been too much to bear in conjunction with the indemnity, which explains his lack of military endeavors during his reign. Some go so far as to suggest that this was intended by the Roman Senate to economically hobble the kings of Syria and prevent them from wielding the same level of influence as Antiochus III once had. This might be a bit of a stretch, since in the earliest stages of his reign, Antiochus IV paid off the last portion of the indemnity to the Roman Senate, which would imply that it was in arrears since it theoretically ought to have been repaid years earlier as per the terms of the treaty. Yet we have no evidence that the Romans were hounding the dynasty despite being late with the payments, which would suggest that they were not particularly bothered by the circumstances. Yet it was probably no coincidence that the plundering of the Temple of Jerusalem was connected to the Sixth Syrian War. Temple robbing was a frequent habit of Seleucid rulers, with no less than 10 instances across the dynasty's history. Antiochus IV himself is tied to 4 of them, and his father Antiochus III also did it twice, with most probable cause for those instances was the need to pay for their military conquests. Depending on when you place his attack on Jerusalem, it would have been just after the invasion of Egypt in 169, or it would have been on his returned march to Syria in 168. The war against the Ptolemies would have been expensive, and while we know his wagon train was loaded with the goods of looted Egyptian temples, it would have been an attractive option to seize the treasure inside the Temple of Jerusalem. In my opinion, Antiochus' attack on Jerusalem was not tied to a missionary zeal for Hellenism, nor a desperation brought about by short cash flows. Instead, we must look to his rise to power to better explain his circumstances. As a usurper, Antiochus had a very shaky claim on the throne of Syria, since according to the traditional protocol of Macedonian kingship, it ought to have been passed down to one of the sons of Seleucus IV. The eldest, Demetrius, was in Rome, but the younger prince Antiochus was taken into Epiphanes' protection under dubious claims, considering that he executed his nephew in 170 at about the same time his own son was approaching pre-adolescence. His subsequent behavior then appears to stem from a desire to gain legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and his neighbors. His generous benefactions to cities and temples, adopting the imagery and epithets befitting a semi-divine ruler, even his more unorthodox quirks that Polybius so gleefully reports, are all a part of making a wider appeal. But there was a cost to these performative activities, and gifts were proving expensive, even if he wasn't running short of funds. There appears to be a clear plan to restructure the inner workings of his empire to try and stabilize it, while also finding new ways to come up with greater forms of control. In an earlier episode, we talked about the changes that were taking place in the city of Babylon during Antiochus's reign, namely the introduction of the politai. As part of its partial reorganization, Babylon saw the creation of a gymnasium and role of ephebes. There were even new officials appointed by the Seleucid government within the temples of Babylon and Uruk, whereas it was previously kept within the same families for generations prior. If we compare this to events happening in Jerusalem, the parallels are startling. When approached by both Jason and later Menelaus, it would make sense why Antiochus found their proposition so appealing. The prospects of a Judean priesthood personally loyal to him, coaxed along with the promise of further revenues, must have been quite appealing to the king. However, since the troubles of Jerusalem threatened the stability of coyly Syria in a time of war, this was tantamount to an outright rebellion, especially in a satrapy that was so recently integrated into the empire and subject to conflict. If it was not an uprising of the community at large, Antiochus seems to have believed it to have been one. Punishment must be delivered, lest it show that he tolerated any threat to his rule. And if the king could reap a hefty bounty from his prize, then all the better. At the time of the persecutions, there lived a prominent priestly family of Jewish nobles in the village of Modein, located roughly 32 kilometers to the northwest of Jerusalem. Their patriarch, Mattathias, was from Jerusalem, but moved to the countryside along with his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. This third son is the most famous, perhaps better known in conjunction with his nickname, Judas Maccabee. Maccabee is based on the Hebrew word Maccabee, meaning hammer. Thus the full name reads Yehuda ha-Maccabee, Judah the Hammer, a testament to his skills as a warrior. Technically speaking, Maccabees is not the name of the family. Instead, they are described in our sources as the Hasmoneans, which Josephus claims is from a shared ancestor named Hasmoneus. However, the nickname of Maccabee is also applicable to the family and eventually their followers. As we have alluded to, this is the group that would kickstart the Maccabean Revolt and eventually establish an independent kingdom under the Hasmonean dynasty, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. According to 1st Maccabees, a group of Seleucid soldiers came to Modein in 167 to investigate and root out any active practitioners of the Jewish faith. In the guise of requesting sacrifices be made in the name of the king, one of the royal officers promised that the Hasmoneans would be named friends of the king and be given a position of prominence within Jerusalem. Mattathias refused the offer, boldly declaring that he alone would maintain in his faith in upholding the covenant. When another Jew stepped up to the altar to take the opportunity, the patriarch killed him and then the Seleucid officer. Destroying the altar, he proclaimed loudly for all those who were still loyal to the laws of Moses to join him in the wilderness and to take up arms against their oppressors. He and his sons were said to flee into the mountains to seek refuge from the vengeful king. 2nd Maccabees differs, claiming that Judas, along with 9 others, fled Jerusalem during the midst of the second attack on the city and fled into the desert, neglecting to mention Mattathias at all. It is possible that the scene at Modein was fabricated into a national myth, or an event that was ignored to emphasize Judas as a greater hero, but the rebellion had begun regardless. Linking up with another group of warriors known as the Hasidians, suggesting that there were multiple rebel bands active in the area, the Maccabees first targeted not the Seleucid army, but cooperating Jews, namely the Hellenizers, but likely bystanders as well. The rebels were employing guerrilla tactics by taking action during the night, and disappearing back into the wilderness near the Gofna Hills, as the hilly Jewish countryside, and especially the more desert-like regions, were perfect hiding places for bands of resistance to take refuge in. Villages were attacked, the pagan altars were destroyed, and First Maccabees proudly claims that Jewish boys who had not yet undergone the procedure were forcibly circumcised on Mattathias' orders. The goal was clearly to inspire terror, both to the Seleucid government and to those who were conflicted in whether to support the Maccabean cause. By the spring of 166, Mattathias had died of old age, and Judas was elected as the group's new leader. Word of his activities reached a local official named Apollonius, who gathered an army from Samaria to confront these northern rebels. The Maccabees managed to successfully ambush the force near Lebana and destroyed it. And like with David's slaying of Goliath, Judas took Apollonius' sword off his body to claim it as his own personal weapon. News of the defeat made its way north to Syria, where an ambitious commander named Saron looked to gain prestige by taking revenge for the defeat of Apollonius. Yet again, the rebels managed to get the jump on their foes as they ascended the mountain pass of Beth Zur, killing 800 and scattering the rest into the countryside. With each victory, Judas and his followers were able to loot the bodies, becoming better equipped and organized as time went by, as their reach extended ever closer to Jerusalem. The deeds of the Maccabees were by now making their way up the chain of command within the empire, and in early to mid-165, their existence was made known to the Seleucid court. At this time, Antiochus was preoccupied with a much larger imperial project, and had led half the army into the upper satrapies, so the responsibility to crush this rebellion was left to his standing regent, Lysias, who was responsible for the western half of his empire. He delegated the task to the governor of Coele-Syria and Phoenicia, Ptolemy, son of Doramenes, who in turn assigned it to one of the king's Philoi, named Nicanor, and a co-commander named Gorgias. While the figure cited by First Maccabees is way too large to be taken at face value, Nicanor's army was certainly the biggest Judas ever faced up to this point, and they had assembled near the plains of Emmaus about 28 kilometers from Jerusalem. The rebels were stationed in the town of Mitzpah further south, and to combat the growing concern about the incoming Seleucid army, Judas ordered an assembly where they partook in their rituals of fasting, consulted the teachings of the Torah, and spoke prayers asking for aid from God in the upcoming battle. Thereafter, the Maccabean force of 3,000 soldiers marched out towards Emmaus, sending the remaining half of the rebels back to their homes. Meanwhile, Gorgias broke away with a division of infantry and cavalry to try and catch the Maccabees off guard under the cover of night, but he only discovered the remains of the rebel camp. Judas had already caught wind of this plan and managed to get around to the dwelling where Nicanor and the rest of the Seleucid army were stationed. Calling upon his men to not fear the size of the enemy's encampment, and to remind them that they were carried by God's providence, Judas led his men in a charge down the slopes against their hated foe. The shock and awe of this attack caused the camp to panic. Many were cut down as they were scattered in their flight, while others managed to escape to Idumea and the surrounding areas. The Jewish rebels managed to restrain themselves from looting the dead Seleucid troops before whirling around and confronting the returning Gorgias and his detachment. The day belonged to the Maccabees, who marched back home singing hymns while carrying plundered treasure and bundles of purple cloth on their shoulders. With the defeat of Nicanor and Gorgias, Lysias realized that the threat of the rebel Jews was becoming problematic to the stability of the satrapy. By now, the Maccabees were furnished with far better gear and supplies taken from the Seleucid dead, and the news of their first victory over an army of ample size would inevitably draw more followers to Judas's mission. Not to mention that his own position as standing regent meant that the blame for every failure would come back to him, so a change of policy was needed. Presumably as a consequence of his failure, Ptolemy, son of Doramenes, had been replaced as strategos of Coeli Syria by Ptolemy Macron, the man who turned Cyprus over to Antiochus during the Sixth Syrian War. According to a letter preserved in 2 Maccabees, this Ptolemy met with a Maccabean embassy in the autumn of 165 to negotiate a settlement, the terms of which had to be relayed to Epiphanes, who was in Iran by that point. Evidently, Ptolemy was able to maintain good relations with them, and it seems that the high priest Menelaus was involved in the negotiations as well. Based on his response in another document dating to the late March of 164, Antiochus did not seem to agree with the terms suggested by Ptolemy and Lysias, instead only offering to concede a few specific points, namely the edicts against kosher diets and the Torah, but refused to change his stance on anything to do with the temple or his governance of Judea. He did offer a general amnesty to those who wished to go back to their homes, but he only gave a 2-week period for them to comply with this request, either to pressure them into submitting or to torpedo negotiations outright. We also get mention of a Roman embassy making a visit at this time, the first documented encounter between Rome and Judea, to help oversee the process, offering words of support for concessions to the rebels in order to bring about a general peace within the region. Antiochus's terms were not well received by the Maccabean leadership, so negotiations collapsed by April of 164. Peace was no longer an option. So in that October, Lysias summoned an army to confront the rebels head-on. Rather than coming from the north through the Judean hills, the regent took the long way round and came from the south through Idumea, before encamping near at the site of Beth Zur, a fortress located a few kilometers north of Mount Hebron. While probably nowhere near the 65,000 men that the sources claim, this was a much greater host than what Judas had ever faced, who is said to have brought about 10,000 of his own warriors to the battlefield. The description of 1st Maccabees is brief, but the Hasmonean rallied his forces and charged against the Seleucid troops as they tried to fortify the area. In 2nd Maccabees, it is said that the faithful Judeans sent their prayers begging for relief from the torments of Lysias, and this time God listened, sending an angel on horseback, clothed in white, carrying weapons of gold onto the battlefield to help rally the troops and smite the enemies of Israel. No divine intervention need be applied in this case. Lysias made a retreat after taking casualties and returned to Antioch empty-handed. With the Seleucid army no longer within Judea, the way to Jerusalem was now open to the victorious Maccabees. Leading his army to the walls of the city, he sent many to attack the garrison that was stationed inside, while he and his closest followers marched upon the temple. It was a mere shell of its former glory, and so they set upon restoring the once magnificent sanctuary. The abomination of desolation was pulled down, and a brand new altar was set up along with the various adornments of the Holy of Holies. In December of 164, on the 25th day of Kislev according to the Hebrew calendar, exactly 3 years after it was converted to accepting all foreign cults, Judas oversaw the reinstitution of the daily sacrifices, thus purifying the temple and restoring harmony within the covenant. Quote, "The Jews celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing, in the manner of the Festival of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year." End quote. This festival, which by the time of Josephus was called the Festival of Lights, is better known to us as Hanukkah, dedication in Hebrew. Those who celebrate this holiday today may notice that neither book of the Maccabees explains its most recognizable tradition, the lighting of the 8 candles of the menorah. The explanation behind the practice instead comes from the Babylonian Talmud, a collection of teachings compiled during late antiquity. A passage describes the so-called miracle of the oil. Upon the recapture of the city, it was learned that the Greeks had polluted all of the oil in the temple that was to be used for the menorah, but one lone jar was discovered with its seal still unbroken. It ought to have only been enough supply for a single night. Nevertheless, it continued to burn for 8 days straight. Of course, this was written hundreds of years after the revolt itself occurred, but the Hanukkah story became intertwined with the notion of Jewish identity and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. One question that is still outstanding: what was the aim of the Maccabean revolt? Taking the Jewish sources at their word, particularly that of 2nd Maccabees, we might believe that the motivations of the rebels was due in large part to the supposed ideological conflict between Judaism, Judaismos, and Hellenism, Hellenismos. Throughout the work, the Maccabees, with Judas in particular, and their followers, are consistently described as being faithful to the practices of Judaism. On top of consciously mentioning his observance of the covenant and Mosaic law, Judas is described as a return to the model as seen in the heroes of ancient Israel. His military activities and successes are drawn in parallel to those of King David, and his reconsecration of the temple echoes that of Solomon. Contrast this with the activities of the Hellenizers, particularly the high priests Jason and Menelaus, who spearheaded the introduction of Greek culture and institutions, the rejection of Jewish identity, and eventually leading to the calamitous attack and persecution by the wicked king Antiochus. As I hope I demonstrated in the last episode, there was nothing inherently contradictory about being a pious Jew who was also deeply immersed in Hellenistic culture, as we see through countless examples of individuals both in the diasporic communities and within Judea itself. Later, the Hasmoneans would style themselves as the archetypal Hellenistic monarchy, and even the author of 2nd Maccabees, perhaps the most vocal about this matter, is writing in a style that betrays clear influence from a Greek literary culture. Linking back to our earlier discussion, the intervention of Antiochus was the catalyst that led to the outbreak of the revolt, but much of the background is due to the political dealings of powerful Jewish leaders. Jason, Menelaus, and even Mattathias all were vying for some level of control over the affairs of Judea, some using their ties to the king, and others relying on different bases of power. As the Seleucid government sought to reorganize the satrapy of Coeli Syria, this infringed on the political and economic independence of Jerusalem, exacerbating a situation that was building up in the background. A rebellion of some kind broke out, as factions of Jewish groups fought first against each other, then against the Seleucid government until they achieved their ends. In the context of dynastic propaganda, the story of the temple's purification and refoundation by Judas Maccabee is one of legitimization. Across other temple states of the Near East, it was customary for the king to reconsecrate the temples of the patron god of their city as a symbolic representation of order trumping chaos, righting the wrongs of their predecessors, the unjust or illegitimate rulers. As we saw Antiochus I Soter rebuild the Temple of Borsippa and celebrate its restoration through the famous Borsippa cylinder, the Maccabees, or more accurately, the Hasmonean dynasty, would eventually be able to leverage this act to justify their future rule over Judea. With Jason and Menelaus, we have an example of what happens when an illegitimate high priest is in command, contrasting with the virtuous, legitimate behavior of Judas. It is quite possible that none of this was Judas's intent at the time, and was retroactively cast as such by his later successors, who actively sought to justify their rule over Judea, as independence would not be achieved, or sought, for quite some time. As will be seen in future episodes, the Seleucid government had dealt with similar circumstances from dissenting peoples and satrapies, and will come up with different solutions to handle the problem in Judea. For now, though, Judas and his brothers would have to content themselves with the liberation of Jerusalem, for the Seleucid Empire would not tolerate an active rebellion. Lysias' quick retreat from Beth Zur was certainly humiliating, but rather than being entirely due to the overwhelming might of the Maccabees, It is more likely that it was spurred by far more pressing matters. A message was sent from the upper satrapies, alerting the standing regent that a terrible calamity struck the expedition in the east. King Antiochus was dead, and much of his army was in disarray over the incident. Next time, we will conclude the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes and see where the empire's fate may lay.